It's good to be back after 3 years. And I have this strange sense of déjà vu, not just because the first event was also organized in this very hotel, but also because I'm going to talk about much of the same things that I talked about 3 years ago. So my colleagues were talking about migrants and migration. Hungary isn't really about migrants at all. It doesn't really experience any large-scale migration. The borders are closed and militarized. There are 2 transit zones on the southern border that admit 1 asylum seeker every day, weekdays only, where they have to stay until their application is approved with a rejection rate of well beyond 90%. So within this project, we use Hungary as a laboratory example for when migration is not really politicized but securitized, when migrants are presented as a threat to the nation. Now, I'm going to start from this Sunday. You might have heard that we had local elections in Hungary on Sunday, where the opposition parties finally could succeed in forming an alliance, and they took over many major cities in Hungary. Those that are marked with pink went to the opposition. Those that are marked with orange stayed with the governing party, Fidesz, and they achieved the majority in the capital, and the new mayor of Budapest also comes from this opposition alliance. Now, these elections were presented in the Western press as the first crack in Orbán's regime, as this great victory for the opposition. But if you look at the whole country, on the country as a whole, then it's still pretty much orange. So the question might be, what does this have to do with migration? What do local elections have to do with migration? I have 2 posters from the government that they advertised, they put out for the local elections. This one says, "Hungary will not be an immigrant country. This Sunday, let's stand up for Hungary." And this one says, "We need to protect our cities and villages today. Vote." So the message from the government was that the opposition wants to move migrants into Hungary, into those cities that would go to the opposition, which legally speaking is nonsense. No local mayor has the right in Hungary to do so, but that was the message that the government came up with. So we are in 2019. The government is still using fear from migration in local political struggles. So not much has changed, but it's worth going back to the beginning. How did this obsession with migration in Hungary start? I think you are familiar with the imagery of the migration crisis in Hungary, how several 100,000 refugees crossed the country in the summer of 2015, how the border was erected, and how the Orbán regime was featured in the Western press as this black sheep of Europe, those Europeans that are not friendly to migrants. You also need to know that a large-scale anti-immigration campaign was launched in Hungary well before the refugees even hit the country in the early 2015. And this campaign is still going on, and it has a few interesting elements that I would like to talk about today. The first interesting element is that we have had a anti-migration campaign without migrants for 4 years. Certain extreme measures were introduced ever since the crisis hit Hungary. The border wall was erected, new laws were introduced on migration, and these laws were expanded to incorporate civil society as well. And all these laws didn't really require any popular support. They were easily introduced with reference to migration. Then we also see a rise in xenophobic tendencies, an ongoing rise in xenophobic tendencies, despite the lack of any ingoing migration. Hungary, as I said, used to be a transit country. It is not anymore. That's why our Serbian colleagues are facing these difficulties with integration. Another interesting thing is that the campaign is still going on, and it's being constantly expanded. Now it also includes the opposition, any form of political opposition, frankly speaking, civil society, opposition parties, universities, and academia in general. So everyone who is critical of the government is labeled as pro-migration, as someone who wants to move migrants to Hungary. And We also lack any form of counter narratives. The opposition doesn't have a counter narrative like framing migration as a humanitarian problem, or any sort of alternative other than the security frame, migration as a security threat to Hungary. Now, the campaign was constructed based on well-known elements that you might be familiar from Western European campaigns or anti-migration campaigns in Australia. These campaigns usually depict migration, when they talk about migration as a security threat, through three tropes. Migration is an economic threat. The migrants will take away the jobs, and they will be a burden on our welfare system. Migrants are a hard security threat. They are criminals or terrorists or both. And migrants are a threat to our identity. They come from a different culture, so settling them in would dilute our own culture and therefore threaten our society. Now, these were the three posters that the government put out before the refugees arrived to Hungary in the summer of 2015. This one says, if you come to Hungary, you cannot take away the jobs of Hungarians. This one says, if you come to Hungary, you have to respect our laws. And this one says, if you come to Hungary, you need to respect our culture. So it's like a verbatim translation of a textbook through the use of actually Western advisors. So the original campaign was pretty much a standard anti-immigration campaign. It was heavily mediatized and has since evolved into an openly racist and openly Islamophobic campaign that is updated and maintained on a daily basis through government media outlets. By the end of the 2015, the campaign shifted somewhat. It was reduced to this third element, the identity element. Now the campaign exclusively talks about a threat to Hungarian national identity, and it conflates the other two axes. So migrants are a threat because they come from a different culture, and this culture, Muslim culture, equals terrorism and it equals crime as well. Migration is now used as a master frame meaning that the government subsumes all and every political problem under the frame of migration. Everything and everyone can be connected to migration. And this master frame is about, as I said, a threat to national, but also European identity. So we also see the elevation of the campaign on the European level. Migrants are not only threatening Hungarian identity, but also European identity. And Hungary is the first and last line of defense for all of Europe. Hungary represents true Europe. It defends real European values, and these real European values are not about multiculturalism, but they are about Christianity and state sovereignty. So this is, again, borrowed from other places like Russia, but that's how migration is currently depicted. It's also depicted through a number of historical analogies. Migrants are compared to the Turks who invaded the country in the 16th century, and European elites who are friendlier to migration are compared to the Soviet Union that tried to infringe on Hungarian sovereignty. And as I said, this frame has been expanded to include every form of political opposition. So if you criticize the healthcare system, you are pro-migrant. If you criticize the education system, you are just doing this because you are pro-migrant and your ultimate goal is to move in migrants into Hungary. So this is, again, standard populist fare. You have the populist that represents the pure people, the everyday people, and you have the corrupt elites that are present globally, but also within Hungary, within the opposition, and in Brussels as well. This is just a poster that links George Soros, the favorite boogeyman of the government, with Jean-Claude Juncker, so European elites. So the argument that I'm making here is that Hungarian politics in these 4 years or 3 years since I've been here has become single issue. Every form of criticism that the government receives is quickly turned into and reframed as a problem of migration. A couple of examples. Top left corner, Brussels needs to be stopped because Brussels wants to move in migrants. The one on the upper right, George Soros wants to move in millions from Africa and the Middle East. The one in the lower left corner says these guys want to dismantle the border fence together, and includes opposition leaders and George Soros. And my favorite, the one in the lower right corner, says, the UN wants us to accept migrants on a continual basis. It's our decision, not the UN's. So the UN is also an enemy. Hungary is obviously a member of the EU and the UN as well. And as I said, it's updated on a daily basis. I went online in the break, and I took screen captions from 2 major government media outlets. The articles circled in red are about migration and the threat of migration. Just to remind you, we are right after local elections, so these news should be about domestic politics. They are instead about migration. And it works. National elections from last year, the government once again secured a supermajority in parliament. It was very successful in the European elections, so this kind of framing seems to resonate with ordinary Hungarians. Another example, this was the last poster that the government put out before national elections in 2018. It's openly racist, and it only communicates a single thing, and people living in the UK might be familiar with the image. It's the exact same image that Nigel Farage used in his Brexit campaign. So, how does this rhetoric work? I also argue that this kind of security-based rhetoric is nothing new. The governing party has been engaged in this kind of war rhetoric since it got elected in 2010. We've had a war on national debt, we had a war on banks, we had a war on utility costs, we had a war on Brussels. Every political problem, major political problems, the majority of major political problems are presented through this Schmittian war-like frame. So I would argue that the Hungarian population by now is conditioned to accept political issues through this warlike rhetoric. Of course, a warlike rhetoric also comes with the myth of a capable leader, and that just reinforces the rule of Prime Minister Orbán. And if truly every political problem is presented as a war, then opposing the leader equals treason. So the opposition can be labeled as treasonous. And wars also come with a lot of uncertainty, and under uncertainty, people usually favor the government. So just reinforces and prolongs the rule of the governing party. And this kind of uncertainty is also maintained through other means. Hungary now doesn't have rule of law anymore, it has rule by law. Law is used as a weapon against the opposition, and law is also used as a means to favor party circles and people close to the governing party. The whole campaign and the rhetoric of the government is highly theatric. It's just a play that every Hungarian has a chance to participate in. Hungary is presented as a victim. The villain is clear. The villain is the illegal migrant, but also those that support migration. And Hungary is always conflated with the governing party. So if Fidesz receives criticism in the EPP and Fidesz's rights are suspended, then it's an attack on Hungary and Hungarian people. The Prime Minister is depicted as the hero, the sovereign that is capable and able to act, and the only source of security in these uncertain times. The media reporting, as I demonstrated, is constantly depicting migrants as criminals, as disease-ridden, and as dangerous now in an openly racist fashion. The public is always invoked. Hungarians are in danger, but they are not really needed in its resolution. There's no political debate about what to do about migration. I mentioned all these new measures, like the border fence. There was no real political debate for legitimizing these new measures. So migration was a perfect storm for the government in 2015. The campaign resonated with ordinary Hungarians, and it's politically rational to expand this campaign, and that's what the government is doing. It's trying to prolong this fear of migration to the extent possible. And of course, recent local elections can be depicted as the failure, as the limit to this rhetoric, but it's not going to go away anytime soon. So next question: why is it so successful? Why is it so successful? Why do Hungarians subscribe to this kind of rhetoric? Eastern Europeans, on average, are much more xenophobic than Western Europeans, but their xenophobia differs. They are not afraid of cohabitation, so living with migrants. They are afraid of unknown things, and the migrant is this unknown thing with a face, so they are susceptible to fear-mongering about migration. Hungary is also a special case. It's an illiberal democracy. That's the chosen term of the prime minister. Now he talks about Christian democracy, but he refers to a system of where power relations are very much asymmetrical. The government rules over legislation, and the opposition and the media are severely weakened. These are the players who could normally counteract such a media campaign and this kind of rhetoric. Migration can also be used for a political spin. So Hungary is one of the most corrupt countries in the European Union. Corruption scandals, whenever they come to light, are also framed through this migration master frame. So you're only criticizing this corrupt politician because you support migration. It's very simple. It's when in doubt, migration. So it's used to negate current problems, the problems with the healthcare system, problem with the education system, and it just prolongs the rule of the governing party. Statistics from last year. By now, Hungary has become the most xenophobic country in the European Union. This graph shows you the respondents who reject immigration totally. This means they reject immigration irrespective of the motivation of the migrants, so they also reject war refugees. 48% of Hungarians reject all form of migration. So, where does that leave us? Hungarian politics has become single issue, and this master frame seems to resonate at least with the core electorate of the governing party. And since the electoral law has been changed and it's an unfair electoral law that favors parties that can mobilize a core electorate, the governing party only needs about 2 million people to vote for it, and then it can secure another majority in parliament. Extreme politics is now normalized. Migrant has become an everyday slur that people use, and this kind of warlike rhetoric has become part of the everyday pub discussions on public transportation. So the political culture has also underwent considerable changes in these past 3 years. This kind of fear-mongering, as I mentioned, serves a dual purpose. It mobilizes the core electorate, but also paints over existing policy problems. Now, local elections have shown the limits of this kind of rhetoric, but as I said, it's going to stay here and it's going to remain effective for the near future at least. Because of these reasons, whenever the Hungarian elite talks about migration, for example, on the European level, you should keep in mind that this campaign is not a policy response to a perceived crisis. The Hungarian elite is not really worried about migration. Even if migration would return to the Balkan route, Hungary would just serve as a transit country. But it's just a rhetorical tool to maintain the rule of the governing party. For these reasons, Hungary lacks a foreign policy, especially when it comes to migration policy. Foreign policy decisions have been and will be decided according to domestic considerations. And as I mentioned repeatedly, the campaign is being expanded. More and more perceived opposition is subsumed under the label of pro-migrant forces. So the ruling party is always in need of new folk devils, new villains that it can fight a war against. And I'm happy to say that they found a new one, her. So now government media outlets started writing about environmental Nazis who are also sponsored by the globalist elites that support migration, and you can fill out the rest. Thank you.